you don't already have your Bibles out, I encourage you to be taking it out and be turning to the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, Romans chapter 12, as we'll be spending the vast majority of our time in that text this evening. The book of Romans divides itself down into two major sections. As we go through books, as we went through Luke and through Acts, and when we eventually get to the book of Romans, we'll have an outline we follow for the book as a whole that says, here's sort of the broad picture, broad overview of what the book is about. And so the first section, the first 11 chapters of this epistle is focused on justification by faith and grace. There are some that Paul is having to deal with who are trying to go back towards the old law, and the argument he's making is they're justified by faith through grace, and it's not through the deeds of the old law. And he's having to argue that in the early part of the text. He had to show them 1 through 3 that you all need the gospel, and then he had to start showing them 4 through 8 the fact that that was available to everyone, to Jew and Gentile alike. And yet in spite of that, in 9 to 11, some of the Jews had rejected the message that was preached, and it turned away from serving God. Well, after he spends this time in the first 11 chapters arguing about the fact that it's justification by faith through grace, as he does in a lot of his writings, the Apostle Paul sort of spends the second half in a practical application section, if you will. The application beginning in chapter 12 through 16 is living as a Christian. You can think about it this way. In 1 through 11, his argument is, here's how you become a Christian. Though it's not a long, extensive list of everything, he does argue there about the baptism. He talks about belief and everything as he goes through. And you've now become Christians. Now that you understand you're justified by faith through grace, here's how you need to live in light of that in 12 through 16. Well, as Paul is beginning in chapter 12 to make this point about living as a Christian, and he points out in chapter 12 about our relationship to others. Really, a lot of this section, this practical application section, is about our attitude and how we come to view things. Whether in chapter 12 it's our relationship to one another, or 13 a relationship to the civil government, as well as our relationship to one another. 14 and 15, the relationship between the weak and the strong brethren. In chapters 14 and 15, he's really dealing with our relationships and how that practically applies now as being Christians. Well, in chapter 12, he's dealing with our relationship with others, more specifically, our relationship to one another. And it's important that we remind ourselves from time to time about our relationship as brethren in Christ. And we spend some time looking at passages that remind us about how we need to conduct ourselves in our relationship with one another. So over the next few moments, let us consider some relationship advice given in Romans chapter 12. Not relationship advice. Now, this relationship advice can apply in the marriage relationship, but more particularly, we're applying it in the case here of our relationship with one another. While it could apply in many cases, we're specifically taking this exhortation, beginning at verse 9 in particular, these sort of miscellaneous exhortations when it comes to your relationships, and applying how that applies in our relationship towards one another. So we'll spend some time in Romans chapter 12 this evening talking about relationship advice in Romans chapter 12. The first piece of advice we want to look at is in verse 9, and that is to let love be genuine. Look at verse 9. Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. So we're told in Romans chapter 12 to let love be genuine. Now let's consider some different or various translations of this passage. It'll help us in understanding what he's saying. The New King James and the New American Standard would say, let love be without hypocrisy. The NIV says, love must be sincere. The King James says, let love be without dissimulation. That is, the relationship you have towards one another is not some hypocritical act. It's not some faking of love. But it's genuine, as the ESV says. Or the NIV says it's sincere. That really you have love one for another. That's the idea here in Romans chapter 12. You see, what these translations would tell us, and what we understand from the context, is love is not to be an act. Listen to what Linsky says about love. Love is not to be an act. The imperative idea is now expressed by an adjective, not hypocritical. Hypocrite was the term for show actor, and when the ancient actors always wore a mask while they were on the stage, hence eupo in the compound, genuine love is Paul's bidding. Not stage actor love, no mask of love. 1 John 3:18, let us love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Where love is so highly esteemed, as it is in the Christian church, counterfeit love is often passed out as the real gold coin. And the lack of love attempts to hide itself behind the mask of love and of words that are supposed to have the sound of love. I think Linsky summarizes this idea here in Romans 12 and verse 9 very well. And that is, as the New King James and the New American Standard say, it's love without hypocrisy. Right? You don't have a hypocritical kind of love. And as he points out, the word for hypocrite comes from a Greek word that had to do with stage actors. If you would go to a play that they were having back in these times that the Romans were having, you would see these actors, and you may only have 3 or 4 playing various roles, multiple roles each. And what they would do is they would put on a different mask depending on what they and who they were depicting in this play. And so it's not like today where you say, okay, we need 16 characters, so we're going to cast 16 people. You might only have 4 people, and each of them have to play 4 different people in this play. And so what they would do is put on a mask, hiding their true identity, and instead faking to be someone else. Well, that's the word that has to do with this mask wearer is the idea, or the word used as hypocrite in the New Testament. And the idea is you're not wearing a mask to hide your true self. So, considering that definition of the word, what he's saying here in Romans 12 is, don't put on a fake mask of love. Don't put on a mask that hides how you truly feel and act like you love one another. Instead, it needs to be true, genuine love for one another. That's the point he's making here. Reference 1 John chapter 3 and in verse 18, little children, let us love in word, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. It's one thing to come and say that you love somebody. You can say it with words, but if you don't back it up with actions, it doesn't mean anything. On the flip side of that, you may never say it, but the attitude one possesses may show that they love one for another. You see, the point that John is making is it's not in word or talk, not just in talk, oh, I love you, but now my attitude says something else. Instead, we're loving in deed and in truth. You've heard the saying, don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. That's the idea here in 1 John chapter 3. Don't talk a big game like you love one another. Actually show the attitude of love one for another. That's the point that's being made here in Romans chapter 12. So, we want to have good relationships together as brethren. We need to have love that is genuine. Now, what does genuine love look like? How does love act genuinely? Now, we'll go to 1 Corinthians 13. We're not going to spend a great deal of time here. We talked about this passage in detail last week, but there are 4 things I want to quickly point out from 1 Corinthians 13 about genuine love to help us understand how genuine love will act. Number 1, love that is genuine is love that is patient or long-suffering. Love is patient and kind. Are you willing to suffer along with your brethren in a situation? Now, that doesn't mean you put up with wrongdoing. I think that sometimes people say, well, you got to be patient and long-suffering, and we want to tolerate wrongdoing. That's not what he's saying. But if somebody does something, are you willing to give them a chance to change? Are you willing to be patient with them? Are you willing to be patient with people to give them an opportunity to grow? Do we have a genuine love that is patient and long-suffering? Are we kind towards one another? Again, love is patient and kind. Genuine love is kind. Genuine love is not focused on self. It's not rude. It does not insist its own way. It is not irritable or resentful, the English Standard Version says. And it does not rejoice in wrongdoing. And as we mentioned last week, it believes all things. That doesn't mean love is gullible. It means love is willing to give the benefit of the doubt. When there's a situation where there could be two possibilities, and one could be good or bad, as we used the illustration last week. If you're driving down the road and you see a member pulling out of the liquor store, you might think, well, did they go in there and buy something? Or perhaps their car broke down and they had to change a flat tire or something, and that's why they're pulling out of there. And if you talk to them and they say, well, my tire went flat, love says, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. I have evidence absolutely to the contrary. And so true, genuine love is going to believe all things. That is going to give the benefit of the doubt. Amen. And that's what true, genuine love does, is it's long-suffering, it's kind, it's not focused on self, and it's willing to believe all things. And that is the genuine love that Romans chapter 12 calls upon us to have for one. But not only are we told to let love be genuine, we're told in verse 10 to love one another with brotherly affection, or be devoted to one another in brotherly love. There are two words used to talk about love in the New Testament. There's various forms of these, but we have the basic root, agape, and phileo, or Philadelphia. Sounds familiar? It's where we get the city Philadelphia from, the city of brotherly love. It's the word meaning is brotherly love or affection. And so we need to have this agape kind of love for one another, but then we need to be devoted to one another in brotherly affection. Or we need to love one another with brotherly affection. Romans chapter 12 and in verse 1, or verse 10 rather. Let's look at some various translations here to help us understand what this means. What does it mean to love one another with brotherly affection? The New King James says, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love. The New American Standard says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. The NIV says, be devoted to one another in love. And the NCSB says, show family affection to one another in brotherly love. So what exactly is that saying? Well, I think Albert Barnes summarizes this very well in what he says about verse number 10. He says, be kindly affectionate. The word here used occurs nowhere else in the New Testament. It properly denotes tender affection, such as that which subsists between parents and children. And it means that Christians should have similar feelings towards each other as belonging to the same family and as united in the same principles and interest. I think he summarizes that well. To word it another way, the focus here is on the fact that we have a family relationship in the church. That we are brethren. We are a spiritual family. That's why in Hebrews 13 and in verse 1 it says to let brotherly love continue. That's why time and time again, as writers of the New Testament are addressing the audience, they'll address them as brethren. That's why we have, again, brotherly love for one another. And again, we are all children of God. And we are brethren one with another. And so we're being part of the same spiritual family means that we need to have a love for one another, not just this agape love, but this brotherly love or family love for one another. The agape kind of love we already talked about, this genuine love, is sort of a foundation, if you will. I think the best way to think about agape is it's the foundational love. So when you go throughout the scriptures, husbands, love your wives. Husbands, agape your wives. Love your enemies. That's agape your enemies. So as you go throughout the scriptures, and those points that are being made. Agape is a kind of love told time and time again. God is agape. That's the word used over in 1 John. That's a foundational love. And we need to have that love for one another, and it needs to be genuine. We just saw that in verse 9. But it's not just this agape foundational love that's going to look out for the best interest of others. That's the kind of love we have even for our enemies. But then we have this phileo or Philadelphia kind of love, this brotherly love, this love for one another as family. Now concerning brotherly love, 1 Thessalonians 4:9, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. Brotherly love, this phileo or Philadelphia kind of love, the love of family. You see, here's the point we need to understand. Just as a physical family is devoted to one another, we should be devoted to one another. Perhaps you've seen or heard, or maybe yourself have said at some point of somebody, some situation where if it was just some friend, you wouldn't have anything to do with it anymore, but they're family. Because there's a close-knit relationship in family. And the point is that we, as children of God, are brethren one with another, and we need to have this kind of brotherly love, this kind of same devotion we would have to our physical family. That's the point being made here in Romans 12 and in verse 10. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Be devoted to your spiritual brethren, the same way you'd be devoted to your physical brethren. How do we have a good relationship? Well, according to Romans chapter 12, according to the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, if we want to be devoted, or if we want to have a good relationship with one another, the advice is to let love be genuine, to be devoted to one another in brotherly love. The advice is to take the lead in the relationship. Take the lead in the relationship. Well, this doesn't want to work. The point is to take the lead in the relationship we have with one another. Love one another, verse 10, brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Outdo one another. That's the point being made here in Romans chapter 12 and in verse 10. Now, outdo sounds like some kind of competition. That's what it really sounds like. But that's not at all what is being said here in Romans chapter 12 and in verse 10. The New King James would say, in honor, giving preference to one another. The New American Standard says, give preference to one another. And honor yourself. The Message, it's more a phrase, but occasionally it captures the thought pretty well. Practice playing second fiddle. That's what the Message said. That's not a very accurate translation, but I think it's a good summary of what is being said there in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. Are you willing to, Sean Ray, I'll have it up working again. Thank you. It means that we're going to take that lead in the relationship. It's not a competition, but we're going to be willing to play second fiddle if we have to. We're going to give preference to others. We're not viewing ourselves as more important than others. Now, I want to think for just a second about the definition of our terms here. Honor and to give preference here. The word honor, according to Mounts, who is a student of the Greek and has done a lot of writing in the Greek, in his lexicon or his dictionary of the Greek language says that the word honor is a pricing estimate of worth, a price of value, a price paid. I mentioned a thing of price, a collectively precious thing. Preciousness, substantial value, real worth. Careful regard, honor, state of honor, dignity, honor conferred, observance, veneration. The marks of favor and consigned. And all those passages are verses that he has that are listed on the board, are verses in which he believes the previous definition in those texts. So the point of honor is there's a pricing of something. That is the value you place on something. So when we're coming to view others, giving honor and preference in honor, what he's saying is when it comes to the value or the worth we see in others and how we come to view them. And then Vine says the word for preference means to go for or to take the lead. So the idea is you take the first steps. You take the lead in giving honor. That's why he says outdo one another. It's not that he's saying, okay, here's a competition here, and so here's what I'm going to do. And then the next person says, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do more than you did. And then you say, no, I'm going to do more than you. And like it's a competition back and forth. That's not the point. The point is you be willing to be the one to take the lead in that relationship. You be the one willing to take the first steps. In fact, is this not the same as Paul's instruction, or at least very similar, in Philippians chapter 2, 1-4? So if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and being of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Look, each of you, not only in his own interest, but also at the interest of others. Are we esteeming others greater than self? Am I esteeming others as greater than myself? Am I willing to look at myself humbly and look out for their interest and realize their worth more so than I try to lift myself up? We talked this morning about the need for humility from 1 Peter chapter 5. And if we're esteeming ourselves as better than others, then we lack the humility that God calls upon us to have. Instead, we esteem others as greater than self. In fact, is Jesus not the perfect example in that? Is he not the perfect example? Verse 4 again, let each of you look not only on his own interest, but also on the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. That's verse 5 now. Who, though he was existing in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus humbled himself and esteemed others as greater than himself. That's why he sacrificed himself for you and for me. And we need to have that same attitude of esteeming others as better than ourselves. And again, bringing back to what we said a moment ago, it means I need to take the lead in the relationship with my brethren. I've heard of this being said before in the marriage relationship with people. Somebody will come, for a preacher say they've had people come to him before that say they're talking to somebody who says they've got problems with their marriage. And then he'll say, well, just as soon as she's what she needs to be, then I'm going to start being what I need to be. And then you go talk to her and she says, well, as soon as he starts being what he needs to be, I'm going to be what I need to be. Because I think sometimes we have that same attitude when it comes to our relationship to one another. Once somebody else takes the lead, then I'll gladly follow in behind them. But what we're called to be is the one taking the lead. What we're called to be is the one that's going to go out first. Outdo one another. After all, we're to submit to one another, according to Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 21. According to 1 Corinthians 9, we should be the servant of all. Though I am free of all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. Paul said in teaching others, though I'm free from all, I make myself a servant of all. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. Though outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Paul's point here is that when he goes to these different people, not that he compromises the truth, but he becomes a servant of all, and whatever he needs to be to help that person, that's what he's going to be, to help win that individual, because he esteems them as greater than himself. I have these liberties, Paul's saying. That's what 8, 9, and 10 of 1 Corinthians is about, is the abuse of liberties. And Paul's saying, I've done that. I'm free of all, but I've become the servant of all in whatever way I need to be, as long as it's not compromising truth, that I might win some. Why? Because he esteemed them as better than himself, and he was willing to take the lead in those relationships. In his case, so he might convert others. In our case, so we can have the relationship with one another that God demands. In fact, it is my brother's good that I value the most of all. We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. Are we willing, in this case again in Romans 15, to lay aside our own liberties, what we believe we should be able to do within the confines of God's Word? Are we willing to become the servant of all and look out for the good of my brethren more than the good of myself? After all, that love we talked about already demands that. And if I want to take the lead in giving honor, I've got to be the one willing to compromise when truth is not at stake. And so, if I'm willing to do that, then I can outdo one another in showing honor. How do we have good relationship with one another? Well, the relationship advice in Romans 12 says to love genuinely, to be devoted to one another, to take the lead in the relationship, and then it says to build the relationship. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Verse 15. Verse 13, contribute to the needs of the saints, seek to show hospitality. Any relationship, I don't care what kind of relationship it is, any kind of relationship requires work in order to be successful. I don't care if it's a relationship between friends. I don't care if it's a relationship between family. I don't care if it's the husband and wife relationship, parent-child relationship. Every relationship requires us putting forth effort. And it takes work to get it to where we want it to be, to where it needs to be. Well, it's the same thing when it comes to our relationship to one another. It takes some work. Sometimes the question gets asked, why is withdrawal not as successful as we hope that it would be? And I think there are a variety of factors that play a part. Sometimes people just don't care about the relationship that may be lost. Maybe it's not successful because we haven't followed the command as God has said to the full extent and not severed that relationship. And then I think sometimes the reason withdrawal may not be successful is because we didn't really have a relationship to sever in the first place. Here's what I mean by that. We're brethren, and they may be part of the same local church that we are, but we go to withdraw from somebody. Is there anything really missing? Did we build a relationship with one another to when we say that according to the Scriptures, I no longer can have anything to do with you? Did they actually miss something? Or is it sort of, things on as they were before? Because we waved hi when they walked in the building and we waved bye when they walked out of the building. Maybe we shook their hands. And then we didn't have any kind of real relationship with one another. So that when we actually carry out church discipline, somebody says, well, maybe because we didn't have enough relationship in the first place, we're missing something. How do we get that kind of relationship? By putting in effort. By working at it. You see, we must work to build those relationships with one another. We need to be willing to help those in the time of need. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Romans 12 and in verse 13. We need to be hospitable towards one another. Verse 4 is to show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Romans 12 and in verse 13 says, seek to show hospitality. Find opportunities. And then we need to be willing to share with them in the good and the bad. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Are we there for our brethren to the point that if they're in the time of need, we're there to help? Are we willing to show the hospitality, in fact, seek out opportunities to do it? Are we there for them to rejoice with them when times are good? Are we there for one another to be the shoulder to cry on when times are bad? That's what it takes to build the right kind of relationship with one another. If you want to have a good relationship with your brethren, then what we need to realize is we've got to build it. It doesn't just happen overnight. They don't walk in the building one day and we're part of the same local church and all of a sudden we're as close as physical brothers just as we're called upon to be. But instead we've got to be willing to work to build that relationship. Relationship advice in Romans chapter 12. Let love be genuine. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Take the lead. Build the relationship. 2 more points and the lesson will be yours. Be of the same mind toward one another. Or as the ESV says, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. This is important. In fact, it's actually stated twice in the book of Romans. Here in 12:16, to live in harmony. And then later on in chapter 15, and that should be verse 5, not verse 15. Verse 5. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus. Now, there's a couple of different views on the idea of being of the same mind. There's two different views. We'll talk about those for a second. And then I'll give an explanation as to what I think it is. The different views are, number one, it means to live in harmony. Again, that's how the ESV, which is what I preach from, translates. The NIV does as well. Live in harmony with one another. That is, we have agreed goals. We agree on our views. We agree in what we believe. Now, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, there may be things of indifference, but when it comes down to what we believe, we have one mind because we follow and believe the same Bible. And we're agreed in our goals. That's the goal of heaven, or the goals we may have for the church. What our views are of what the Bible says, what our beliefs are about the Bible. That we agree with that and we live in harmony with one another. That's one view. The other is that you seek after the same things for one another as you seek for yourself. That's the idea others have. Syriac translations say, and you think concerning yourselves the same thing also think concerning brethren. Godet said, the only possible meaning is aim at the same object for one another as for yourselves. That is to say, having each the same solicitude for the temporal and spiritual well-being of his brethren as for his own. So the Syriac translations here in Godet is saying that the idea is you need to think for your brethren and want the same things for yourself. Both could be true. Which one is it? Well, we said it's mentioned twice in the book of Romans, and both may be included in the thought of living in harmony. In chapter 12 and in verse 16 is connected with humility. That is, it seems Paul saying not to elevate yourself above others. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own eyes. And so, and here, Romans 12, we're connected to the idea of humility, versus Romans 15 is connected with the idea of unity, mind and mouth. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant to you to live in such harmony with one another. That is, being unified is after the example of Christ, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's in a context where Paul is talking about discussing our responsibility toward a weaker brother. So it seems that both could be possibilities based on the context. You need to live in harmony with one another and agree on your goals, your views, your beliefs. And then you need to be willing to seek for your brethren the same thing that you seek for yourself. After all, is that not the goal? Both seem to be true based upon the way the context are used. My argument would be, whether you argue one way or the other from the context, both biblical principles are true based on the passages. So we need to understand that either way, whichever one this text may be talking about, that both are true. We need to agree in what we believe. Coming back to the Bible, it's standard. And then we need to be willing to seek the best interest of others and not elevate ourselves above others. Again, both are true. If we want to live in harmony, we need to be willing to put others first. Not just by taking the lead, but put others' interests and seek for them the same good we seek for ourselves, and also by living according to the same word and having the same beliefs in the Bible, having the same belief in God's word. And finally, if you want to have a good relationship with one another, as much as depends on you, live peaceably. Three things about this statement we want to understand. Number one, as much as depends on you. Let's understand this. Peace is not always possible. It depends on both parties. If you're truthfully going to have peace with somebody, then you're seeking to have peace with them, and they're willing to have peace with you. That's why it's as much as depends on you. In fact, wasn't Jesus rejected? Christ is a messenger of peace. Right? To us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Yet there are people that were in opposition to him, and he's called the Prince of Peace. Only some received what he was teaching. That which was from the beginning. All right, 1 John 1 and in verse 12. 1 John chapter 1 and in verse 12. Well, you're not going to find 1 John 1 and in verse 12. John 1:12. But to all who did not receive him, who believed his name, he gave the right to become children of God. It's those who received him that become children of God. If some received him, that means some did not receive him. Some rejected him. Only some received him, and those were the ones called children of God. And so we need to understand that it's as much as depends on us. You may not have peace with everybody, but it better not be because you're not trying to have peace with everybody. That's the point. In fact, I must be a peacemaker. I must seek peace. In Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 9, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." In 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 11, it says, "Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue." We're seeking and pursuing peace. Somebody said in our relationship together, there's some trouble there. Well, if both of us are seeking and pursuing after peace, then we can work through that. Which comes back to, how do we work through that? Being of the same mind. And then we can work through that. So as much as depends on you, it may not always be possible, and there may be some that aren't willing to have peace with you. But if you don't have peace with somebody, it better not be because you're not trying to have peace. That's the point here in Romans 12 and in verse 18. As much as depends on you now, live peaceably. Again, we said we're peacemakers. We need to be seeking to live in peace. But let's understand this word peace. According to the Lexham Theological Word Book, it means to live in harmony, the action of living in concord with others. This verb can denote causing other parties to live in peace or to resolve the divisions between them. Swanson's DBL says, behave in a way to promote harmony. Barnes says in his commentary, this command doubtless extends to everything connected with strife. It means that we are not to provoke them to controversy or to prolong it when it is commenced. That is, as a peacemaker, we try and avoid conflict. We're not trying to stir something up. We're not trying to cause conflict with one another. That's what it means to be a peacemaker. And then finally, not only as much as depends on us should we live peaceably, but we should live holy. There are at times that we may try with some, not with others. You may see somebody and they're living in peace with one group, but not another. And now you may say, well, they're not living in peace with their enemies. And obviously we know from Scriptures they need to. That's even what's being pointed out later on here in Romans chapter 12 about dealing with your enemies. But let's understand that there are sometimes we try with some and not with others. We may be cordial to a stranger. Some stranger may come and we're very cordial to them. We're excited and we talk to them and we treat them nice. We may treat our friends nice. Yet we may be unkind with our own family. Is that seeking to live in peace with all men? Or we might be kind to those we're not close to. But we got those we're not close to. If you meet somebody on the street, if somebody was on the street, they might say, that's just the nicest person. And then yet we may rip and tear apart our peers and our associates and not treat them kindly. We may make no effort to get along with our enemies. We're content to let them stay enemies, and there's no need to get along with them. That's our thought sometimes, and so we're just going to sort of leave it be. We may try with some, but not with others. But we need to dwell peaceably with all men. And yes, that includes even those who have done us wrong. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established on the evidence of two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. You see, what we need to understand is we need to live peaceably with all men, even those who have done us wrong. Now, they may be over there saying things about us, and they may be causing problems for us, but our job is to try to be a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And we need to seek peace and pursue it in every relationship, but in particular, as we talked this evening, in our relationship to one another. Relationship advice in Romans 12. How do you have a successful relationship with your brethren? Number one, let it be genuine. That is, don't put on a mask of love, fake love, but genuinely have love for one another. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Have that brotherly affection, the same love that we're to have for family. When you take the lead in the relationship, outdo one another in showing honor. Not a competition, but take that lead. Be the one willing to take the first step. We need to build that relationship. Every relationship takes work. Our relationship to one another is no exception. And we must build that relationship with one another. We must be of the same mind. Either, as we said, by going back to the same standard and having unity in beliefs, or by wanting the same thing for others as we want for ourselves, or again, both, as are required in Scriptures. And then finally, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all. That's the relationship advice in Romans chapter 12. The relationships we have as Christians are a great privilege. We have a spiritual family. Family can be a wonderful thing. Family is a wonderful thing. And not only do we have the blessings of physical family, but as Christians we have the blessing to gather a spiritual family. And that's a great privilege that we have that's given us by God. We're part of the family, as we sometimes sing, that's been born again. Part of the family whose love knows no end. For Jesus has saved us and made us His own. We're part of the family that's on its way home. And if we want to have that relationship with one another and treat each other like family, we've got to go back to what the Bible says about our relationship with one another. And Romans 12 gives us great advice on how to be in these relationships one with another. It may be this of the sermon this evening that there's one of our present who may never respond to obedience to the gospel. You take a look at your life and say that I'm not living a life pleasing to God. I'm not taking those steps to become a child of God. Which means you don't have the benefit or the privilege yet of that spiritual family. But you can. You can have the benefit of being part of that family that's on its way home. If you've heard the word of God and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, you can repent of your sins, confess your faith in Him, being buried in the waters of baptism, rising up to walk in the newness of life. Maybe you're here and you've done that, and you say, somewhere along the line, I've not been the kind of Christian I need to be. Instead of a private nature, take it for a private nature. Instead of a public nature, where you desire the prayers of the congregation, then we'll gladly pray with you as well. But no matter what your need is, if you're here this evening and we can assist you in any way, do not come forward to get and as we sing.